Il parle lentement. Il m'endort. Les vieux comme lui devraient rester seuls. He had no idea I understood every word. That was hours later before everything fell apart. Portland, Oregon, December 24th, 2023, Christmas Eve. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with memories. I stood by my living room window watching snow gather on the edges of the porch light. At 62, I had grown used to the silence. My wife Sarah had been gone for 7 years, but her voice still lingered in the corners of this house, soft and calm, like the echo of a song that refuses to end. Most mornings I spent teaching French online to students half my age. Some just wanted to learn how to flirt in Paris, others dreamed of moving to France. I smiled when they asked about my years there. 12 years in Paris had taught me that beauty often hides behind broken things. That morning the phone rang. It was Emily, my only daughter. Her voice was bright, full of something I hadn't heard in her for a long time, pure excitement. "Dad, I want you to come for Christmas dinner tonight. There's someone I want you to meet." I could hear the warmth in her tone. A small laugh escaped me as I asked, "Who is he?" "His name is Julien. He's from France. We met at a wine tasting last spring. He's incredible, Dad. I really think he's the one." Her words hung in the air. The one. Every parent hopes to hear that someday, and yet the phrase carries its own weight. I told her I would be there, of course. When we hung up, the silence returned heavier this time. I walked to the fireplace where Sarah's photo rested on the mantel. She was smiling in that quiet way she always did, her eyes calm but watchful. "Be kind, but keep your eyes open." That's what she used to say whenever Emily brought someone new home from college. I whispered it aloud and smiled. In the afternoon, I polished my shoes, chose the dark green sweater Sarah had given me on our last Christmas together, and picked out a bottle of Bordeaux from the cabinet. It was a 1998 vintage, the same year Emily was born. I thought it might be a nice way to mark the moment. Before I left, Helen Parker stopped by. She was my neighbor, a retired nurse with a sharp sense of humor and no patience for foolish men. She leaned on the doorframe, sipping coffee from a travel mug. "So you're meeting the future son-in-law tonight," she said. "That's the plan. And he's French, right?" "Yes," I said. You can hear the skepticism in her tone without even looking. "Be careful with those," she said, half joking. "They're charming until they're not." I smiled. "You don't believe in romance, do you, Helen?" "I believe in seeing people for who they are before they show you," she said, then gave me a pat on the arm. "You'll do fine. Just watch, don't talk too much." I laughed, thanked her, and locked the door behind me. The drive to Emily's place took 20 minutes. Snow was falling harder by then, turning the streets into something out of an old Christmas postcard. When I pulled up in front of her house, I saw a figure standing on the porch, talking on the phone. It was Julien. He was tall, well-dressed, his back straight, his voice smooth. The kind of man who seemed to have practiced being noticed. I wasn't trying to listen, but the cold air carried his words clearly. "Oui, elle n'a aucune idée." I didn't understand the full sentence, but I caught enough to know he was talking about someone who didn't know something. The tone alone was enough to make me pause. He noticed my car, then slipped his phone into his pocket and smiled. "Robert Wright," he said, walking down the steps. His accent was thick, pleasant even. "That's me," I said, shaking his hand. It was firm but quick, as if he wanted to move on from the gesture as soon as possible. Emily appeared at the door behind him, glowing in the warm light from inside. She ran down the steps and wrapped her arms around me. "Dad, I'm so glad you're here." I smiled, kissed her forehead. Me too, sweetheart. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and pine. Candles flickered on the dining table, and soft jazz played from a speaker somewhere in the living room. It was everything Sarah used to love about Christmas. Emily handed me a glass of wine. Julien poured himself one too, and began talking about his company, Lamarck Imports, which specialized in bringing European wines to the Pacific Northwest. As he spoke, his hands moved elegantly, his smile never faltered. I listened, nodding in the right places, but something about the rhythm of his voice reminded me of my old students, who talked fast to hide the cracks in their grammar. When Emily stepped out to answer a call from a friend, the silence between us felt different. Julien looked around the room, his eyes scanning the furniture, the photos on the walls. He gave a small chuckle. "You have a very traditional home," he said. "It's comfortable," I replied. "It's been this way for a long time." He nodded, took a sip of wine, and turned toward the window. His reflection merged with the Christmas lights outside. For a moment, I thought of Sarah again. She would have noticed everything, the way he never asked me a question, the way his compliments came wrapped in condescension. When Emily returned, she was laughing about something her friend had said. The warmth in her voice filled the room again, washing away the strange stillness that had crept in. I smiled at her and tried to push the thought aside. Maybe I was being too cautious. Maybe Helen's words had made me overly suspicious. But somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that tonight would test every ounce of patience I had learned in 62 years. I looked at Sarah's photo on the mantel one more time before sitting down at the table. The candles flickered, casting slow shadows across the room. And just for a moment, as the clock ticked toward dinner, I could already hear the echo of that sentence again. Il parlait lentement. Il m'endort. Les vieux comme lui devraient rester seuls. I didn't know it yet, but those words would change everything. Snow settled on the porch rail like a quiet promise, and the house breathed in that slow way old houses do when a holiday is coming. Morning had the crisp smell of coffee and pine. I folded back the curtain and studied the sky over Portland. I kept the morning simple. In the bedroom, I opened the old cedar chest and lifted the green sweater Sarah had given me our last Christmas together. I smoothed the sleeves across the bedspread and felt something steadier return to my hands. I moved to the small cabinet where I keep bottles for guests. The Bordeaux from 1998 waited on the middle shelf, a deep red I had not touched in years. The vintage matched Emily's birth year, and that felt right. On my desk lay a slim French volume I had found at Powell's years ago, an early printing of poems by Jacques Prévert. The paper had browned at the edges, and the spine creaked faintly when opened. Then I slid the book into a simple wrapping of brown paper and twine. A book for a man who says he loves my daughter, a bottle for the table, and the sweater to keep the memory of my wife close to my chest. That felt like enough. Helen Parker knocked just as I was pinning a sprig of fir to the bottle's neck with a bit of ribbon. She stepped in with a gust of cold air. "So today is the day," she said, and set her mug on the counter, as if she owned the kitchen. "Ready to meet the famous fiancé." I told her I had taught hundreds of French students, that one more Frenchman could not possibly be a challenge. She told me to remember that politeness is not always sincerity. I thanked her, promised I would watch more than I spoke, and she patted my arm like a coach ending a short practice. By midday, the snow had thickened, and the neighborhood sank into that gentle quiet that comes when people move slower, when tires hiss over fresh powder, and children's voices carry farther. I packed the bottle and the wrapped book into a canvas bag and slid on my coat. Before I turned the key in the lock, I paused at the mantel. Sarah's photo faced the living room with its steady smile. I told her I would be kind, and I would keep my eyes open. Then I went out. The drive to Selwood took 20 minutes, maybe a little more because of the weather, and because I refused to rush a night that needed steady hands. Houses along the river wore strings of warm light. Someone had hung a wreath half as tall as a person on a high window, and it made me laugh out loud, alone in the car. Emily's street showed that particular mix of old Portland bungalows and new money remodels where the trim is too sharp and the paint too perfect. I parked across the street so I could take in the whole front of the house before I walked up. Warm light moved over the front room curtains. A shadow crossed, and I knew by the shape that it was my daughter. I was not trying to listen. The evening itself was doing the carrying. The porch boards creaked faintly under my shoes. As I reached the first step, I heard a voice. Julien stood near the rail with his back to the door, phone in hand, collar turned up against the cold. His tone was soft and assured, a man used to getting his way without raising his voice. Oui, elle n'a aucune idée. Yes, she has no idea. I understood every word. I told myself not to fill blank spaces with fear. I shifted my bag to the other hand and looked down at the bottleneck with its little fir sprig and felt foolishly sentimental for a heartbeat. I cleared my throat so he would not feel ambushed when he noticed me. He turned at once, slipped the phone into his coat pocket, and smiled. His eyes did that measuring thing elegant men do when they meet a father they think might be provincial. "Robert, good to see you," he said, as if we had spoken before. His accent rounded the ER and warmed the BA, a pleasant music I knew well. I said it was good to finally meet him in person and held out my hand. He thanked me for coming out in the snow. I told him Christmas does not wait for weather. He nodded that careful nod that reveals neither agreement nor dissent. Emily opened the door then, and the heat from inside wrapped around us. She reached for my bag and said something about the smell of rosemary and citrus, and how the chicken came out better than she expected. The way joy colors her voice still catches me off guard. It always will. I set the Bordeaux on a side table near the entry and unbuttoned my coat. Julien noticed the label. He said that was an excellent year, that the valley had seen an uncommonly even season, that the tannins would be elegant by now. He said elegant like a man describes silk. I told him the bottle had waited for a night that would matter. He said then it had found the right night. A small fir tree stood in the corner. Emily had wrapped the lights in a loose spiral that made the whole thing look like it was breathing. She pointed me toward the sofa and told me to sit for a minute and catch my breath. I said I was fine and handed Julien the wrapped book. "For you," I said something small. He ran a thumb along the edge of the paper and thanked me, then set it on the console by a bowl of clementines. He excused himself for a moment to check on something in the kitchen. Emily leaned on the back of the sofa near me and whispered that he had worked all week to make tonight perfect. She asked if I liked him already. I told her I liked that she was happy. She squeezed my shoulder and said she knew I would come around. I almost told her I had already arrived, that I did not hold back my love so I could measure men against it, but I decided that kind of speech belongs later. I crossed the room, pushed the door shut, and felt again the cold slide around the edges of the night. In the small pane of glass beside the door, Julien's reflection appeared for a second as he passed in the hall, a confident line of jaw, a smile practiced in tasting rooms and boardrooms. Dinner would start soon. I lifted the bottle again, checked the cork for a fault that would spoil a good vintage. I set it down and pressed my palm to the sweater at my chest, as if to confirm it still knew how to hold me up. The house smelled of rosemary lemon and the faint sweetness of baking apples. From the hallway, footsteps paused. Julien stood beneath the arch and looked toward the living room, as if he were measuring the space for something it could not hold. The lights from the tree climbed his cheekbones and turned his smile into a mask of shine. For a beat, his expression shifted away from charm. It moved into calculation, cool and neat, like a hand sorting coins. Emily called from the kitchen, and the mask returned. He answered with easy warmth and that music in his vowels. I remembered what I saw. Then I smoothed the ribbon on the book, took a breath that tasted of cinnamon and cold air, and stepped toward the table. Emily called from the kitchen that everything was ready. She came toward me, cheeks warm from the oven hair tucked behind one ear, and she wrapped her arms around me. I told her she looked happy, and she laughed and said that tonight felt right. Julien followed a step behind. Hand extended, the smile set perfectly in place. His grip was firm. He looked around at the tree and the garland and the old family photos and said so cozy, very American, as if comfort were a quaint curiosity. We sat at a table Emily had dressed with care. A linen runner, small pine cones she and I used to gather when she was little, 2 candles burning low in old brass sticks that had belonged to my mother. The first bite of roasted chicken carried rosemary and lemon. Green beans snapped clean under the fork. I told Emily it was perfect and meant it. She blushed in that way she never left behind, not even at 30. Julien talked while we ate. He had stories ready. He told me about Lamarck imports and how the Portland market was opening up faster than anyone expected. He said San Francisco had been his base for a while, that the firm's West Coast clients expected attention to detail and a certain palate. He named a few restaurants I had heard of and a few I had not. He said a chef in Napa only trusted him now that a hotel in Seattle had started asking for his recommendations before they printed seasonal menus. I asked the easy questions a father asks to be polite and to listen for seams. How long had he been with the company? What had drawn him to wine in the first place? Where he imagined the industry going in the next 5 years? He had been waiting not for the questions, but for any open door that let him walk into his favorite subject himself. When I mentioned a small producer near Saint-Emilion I had visited years ago, he nodded and said the terroir there was delicate but not remarkable. Emily watched him with pride that came from a clean place. She wanted me to see what she saw, a man building a life with energy and purpose. She kept reaching for his hand. Every time she did, he guided the conversation back to deals and numbers. There were moments when I forgot myself and simply enjoyed the scene. The house was warm and the snow outside pressed its quiet face against the windows. Emily asked me about the students I taught now, if they still tried to skip grammar to learn phrases for cafes and cabs. I told her they always would, that wanting to speak is human, and wanting to do the work is human too, just less fashionable. She laughed, and for a breath everything felt ordinary and safe. Then small details returned. The way Julien's eyes moved when he thought no one watched. The way he steered every topic by 1 degree until it pointed to a place he had already chosen. He asked about Emily's mortgage and whether she had ever considered refinancing while rates were still favorable. He framed it as a general question. Emily said she had not, that she liked the stability of what she had now. He nodded and said of course, and then added that in some cases, a little calculated debt could be a tool. Emily told him she preferred tools she could hold in her hands. She rose to clear plates and bring out the pie she had baked. Julien reached for his phone the moment her back turned. His thumbs moved fast, the screen lighting his face in a cool square. He typed, paused, and then let out a breath meant only for himself. The words came in French, low and almost tender in tone. Cet homme si ennuyeux. This man so boring. The sentence did not surprise me as much as the ease with which he let it fall into the room. He simply allowed the truth he held about me to exist in the air between the centerpiece and the candlesticks. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of Bordeaux, a small mercy on a night that needed one. I set the glass down and folded my hands loosely on the table so I would not do anything else with them. The candle nearest me leaned into a draught, and the flame flickered. My gaze did not move to Julienne. Emily returned with plates and a smile. Julienne put his phone away with careless grace and said dessert sounded perfect. He told her the main course had been wonderful, and that the herbs reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen in Lyon. Emily beamed. I nodded and reached to help her with the pie server. Our hands touched. Conversation turned to lighter things for a while. Childhood holiday memories. The time I tried to string lights on the tallest tree in our yard and learned something about gravity. The year Emily saved her allowance to buy Sarah a scarf that was so ugly we all loved it. Julienne listened and smiled at the right places and told a story about a New Year's Eve in Paris when the city felt like a living thing. It was told well, and I wanted to admire the telling. I tried. The night moved forward the way nights like this do, a sequence of small pauses and small surges. I kept my voice easy and my questions sincere. I did not hide the parts of my life that were ordinary. I did not advertise the parts that were not. Eventually, the plates held only crumbs, and the candles burned halfway down. Emily said she needed 10 minutes to check on a sauce in the kitchen and to rinse a pan before it turned into something that would fight back. She disappeared through the swinging door. The room settled. The refrigerator hummed and the house shifted softly in the cold. Julienne leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He seemed restless in the way of a man who had expected a performance and been given a conversation. He glanced at me and smiled with a faint apology, as if to say that small towns and older men can both be charming in limited quantities. I let the smile pass me like a train I had no plans to board. I thought about all the times Sarah had steadied me with a look or a hand on my sleeve. I thought about the language I had taught for 3 decades and the way it behaves like water, taking the shape of whatever holds it. In the kitchen, I heard Emily humming something soft and familiar. The melody raised the hair on my arms. The night was still beautiful. It did not deserve to be broken by a careless man. I reached for my glass and lifted it slightly, not to toast, just to acknowledge the thread we all walked tonight. I set the glass down without drinking and let my eyes rest on the candle until I felt my face return to neutrality. A neutral face is not the same as a numb heart. It is a kind of discipline. The door swung, and Emily reappeared with fresh plates and a little bowl of whipped cream that had taken more patience than she would ever admit. She set one plate in front of me and one in front of Julienne and kept the third for herself. She asked if we were enjoying the evening. I told her what was true. The house looked beautiful, the food was excellent, and I was glad to be here. Julienne echoed that with slightly different words and a tone that sounded like approval dressed as affection. I kept my eyes on the candle a moment longer and let whatever had changed in me stay where it was private and still. Then I lifted my fork and tasted the first bite of pie and waited for the next turn in the night to show itself. Emily set the pie server in my hand and laughed that the crust had behaved for once. I told her patience was the secret to more than pastry and cut 3 neat slices. She asked for a story from Paris while she fetched coffee. I told her about a baker on Rue Mouffetard who used to slip an extra croissant into my bag when he heard my accent drift. The man said he could always tell a teacher because teachers study the room before they speak. I told her about a rainy evening when the metro stopped and a violinist played under a cracked tile archway and strangers missed their trains on purpose to listen. Julien let me finish and then tilted his head and said that Paris in the 90s must feel ancient now. I nodded and let it pass. Ancient has its privileges, I said, and reached for my coffee. I watched the way he settled back into his chair, one ankle on a knee, the posture of a man who has never had to ask for a place at the table. I told him the 5th, though I had a soft spot for the 11th, where the streets refused to meet at right angles. Emily brought coffee in mismatched mugs and apologized for the cream not whipping as high as she hoped. Julien told her it was perfect. Emily lit up at that and reached for his hand. I told a shorter story then. A Sunday morning at an open-air market when a butcher talked me into buying a cut of meat I had never cooked. Emily loved that one, maybe because it let her mother walk back into the room for a minute. Julien nodded and said that mistakes are a cost of a curious life. The conversation shifted the way conversations do by inches. He asked how long Emily had owned the house. She said almost 3 years. He asked about the rate she had locked in. She told him. He asked if she had ever thought about refinancing while the market was still friendly. Emily said she liked knowing exactly what left her account every month and that she slept well because of it. Julien said there were modern strategies that turned stability into leverage. He used words like flexibility and growth, and he mentioned the West Coast expansion of Lamarck imports. I held my cup with both hands and nodded. I asked him softly what every father eventually asks when money enters a room, and my daughters share what happens to it. He paused. It was not long, the length of a small breath, long enough to notice. He said there were ways to keep things separate on paper. He did not say that her name would always sit first on the deed. He did not say that he would never touch what she had before she met him. Emily picked up on the shape of the moment. She said they were not making decisions tonight, that this was Christmas, and pie tastes best when no one talks about interest rates. I told her I never doubted her courage or her sense. It was true. She has always known when the ground under her feet was hers. Julien said timing mattered, and that he only wanted the best for both of them. He said a house should serve a life and not the other way around. Emily thanked him for caring. The candle flame wavered, then steadied again. I changed the subject to travel because travel is a neutral language. I asked what cities he loved most these days. He said San Francisco for the money, and Seattle for the clean lines, and the way the sky in that city always looked like it had been edited. He said Portland had charm and potential. He said customers here wanted to be led. He was good at leading. Emily asked about New York and Paris in winter. He said he always knew someone. He lifted his cup and drank as if that sealed the thought. I looked at the framed photo on the bookshelf beside the tree, a picture of Emily at 10 years old holding a paper crown against Sarah's forehead, while both of them tried not to laugh. The air moved inside my chest in that careful way it does when memory knocks. I placed my fork on the plate and wiped a crumb with my finger and tasted cinnamon and brown sugar. Julien leaned forward, perhaps thinking he had softened me with stories of grandmothers and kitchens. He said again that a refinance could be a smart move, that aligning personal assets with professional growth was how couples stepped into the life they wanted. Emily stood and began stacking plates. I stood with her. Julien offered to help but did not move. In the kitchen, the water ran, and I could hear the clink of plates sliding against each other and the soft scrape of a sponge along a pan. I stayed in the dining room and waited for Julien to speak again, because silence often invites a person to reveal what they love most. He told me a story about a client in San Jose who nearly doubled his portfolio by taking on a short-term loan to buy distribution rights on a limited run of Burgundy. He said it with the clean confidence of a man who has never had to carry the weight of a wrong guess for very long. I asked him how it ended. He said the client sold on time and that everything worked out. Emily returned and set a small plate of sliced oranges on the table, a habit she picked up in France to keep sweetness from clinging too long to the tongue. We ate in a comfortable quiet or something near it. The heater sighed. The house held all of us polite strangers at a festival that asks for more hope than most days can manage. I thanked Emily for dinner and told her it was one of the best meals I had had in years. She shone. She asked if we wanted a walk around the block to see the neighborhood lights. Julien said maybe later after coffee. He said he needed to check a message for the morning. It would only take a moment. He slipped the phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen as if the room were his pocket too. I watched the candles pool wax against brass that had belonged to my mother. I watched a small bubble form in the wax and then break without drama. Some things reveal themselves in a rush. Some reveal themselves the way water finds a seam in stone. Money is a river like that. A man's true nature always leaks through money talk. Emily poured coffee and laughed about a recipe card smudged years ago with butter and chocolate, and how her grandmother would scold and then lick her own fingers. Julien smiled as if the warmth belonged to him, and then he began again, the easy current of a man who has learned to charm with numbers and names. San Francisco clients who only dealt with him now, a boutique in the Marina district that doubled its sales after following his allocations. A private club in Menlo Park that finally understood Burgundy because he had curated their list. He moved on to Seattle. A waterfront hotel building, a cellar under his guidance. A series of pop-up tastings that created scarcity by invitation. Customers can be foolish when the lighting is right. They will pay far too much for bottles that would never make an honest table. If a market wants to be led, he said the kind thing is to lead it. Emily did not hear the edge under the silk. She heard drive and success and the proof that he could build something. He told her he knew the family and could get a release before spring for a price that would make friends jealous. She laughed and told him jealousy had never been her sport. I carried my coffee to my lips and let time settle. I asked him how he separated his taste from the demands of a sales quarter. He said taste is a business like any other. Emily stood and answered a text she had been ignoring. She excused herself with an apologetic smile and stepped into the hallway phone already ringing in her hand. Julien reached for his phone as if it had been calling to him. He typed, then breathed a sentence softly into the space above the table. Il pense qu'il est intelligent, mais il est dépassé. He thinks he is clever, but he is outdated. The words did not ask permission. They floated into the air as easily as steam from the pie. I turned my head toward the window and watched the Christmas lights from the tree press their colors into the glass. I let my eyes rest on that doubled world and kept my hands still. I had spent my life teaching words, but tonight they became wounds. He put the phone down with 2 fingers and rubbed a spot on the table where no spot existed. The refrigerator motor sighed. The house gave a small tick wood adjusting to cold. Emily came back with a sheepish apology for taking a call on Christmas Eve. She sat and lifted her fork and told me she wanted me to walk with her later to see the house 3 blocks down that put a small train in the yard each year. I said I would like that. Julien agreed that fresh air would be good after dessert. He picked up the conversation where he had left it, as if nothing had happened. He said his firm would likely open a Portland office if the growth he predicted kept its pace. He said he had suggested it to the partners, and they listened when he drew a map. He spoke about market capture and relationships that scale, about how authenticity can be engineered with the right story. He told Emily she was good at creating images that moved people, that her design work could be positioned to help them both. She asked him if that meant he would stay in Portland instead of spending half his time in the Bay Area. He asked what I loved most about living here. I said mornings by the river and the way thunderstorms announce themselves in summer. He asked about my years teaching. He wanted a story about the class that surprised me most. I told him about a boy who could not find his voice until he read a poem aloud about leaving home and how a room full of strangers softened when they heard it. Emily said the market for feeling is the whole world. And that was the first moment I saw her eyes narrow, just a fraction, the way a person shields a candle with a hand in a draft. My mind did its own small inventory. The things he chose to praise, the things he chose not to mention, the reflex to sell an idea even when no one was buying, the habit of ranking people without asking who they want to be sung. None of it made him a villain. Some of it made him untrustworthy. The difference matters. I kept that to myself. He laughed and called it a service. He said human beings love to be told they are rare. Emily brushed a breadcrumb from the table. I told her the crust was perfect, and that if anyone said otherwise, he could argue with the ghosts of her grandmothers. We talked about walking the block to see lights. Julien checked his phone again and murmured something about a message from a distributor in Oakland. He asked for a minute. Emily nodded and began gathering the smaller plates. I stood and carried my cup into the kitchen, ran water over it, and set it in the rack. When I came back to the doorway, I saw Julien at the table with his head bent, reading something, lips moving soundlessly. I could have walked in and asked about his message. Instead, I watched his profile illuminated by the tree as if someone had painted a study of a charming man considering his next move. I placed a hand on the back of my chair and let my palm warm the wood. The room had not changed. Only my understanding had. The difference was small and complete, like the moment a lens turns and a blurry line becomes a sentence. Emily came back with a towel over her shoulder and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. I said yes. Julien said no, then yes, then changed his mind again. He laughed at himself as if indecision were a flirtation. The lights across the street winked on a timer, and the pattern shifted. I looked toward the window, watched my reflection fold into the colored glass, and let the hurt settle into a place I could carry. It was not loud. It did not demand a scene. It was the first breath of something I did not want, and it reached farther than I expected. Small, but deep. Emily slid the pie a little closer and refreshed the whipped cream with a quick sweep of the spoon. Then she touched my shoulder like a small apology for fussing. Julien lifted the Bordeaux and tipped a little more into my glass, then into his own. "Tell me, Mr. Walker, do you ever get tired of repeating old stories?" He delivered it as if it were light, almost playful, but the words carried a fine grit that did not rinse away. Emily gave a quick, embarrassed laugh. She said Dad does not repeat, he curates. Then she brushed a crumb from the table and asked if we needed more forks, because the dessert plates were small. Her steps faded and the doorway emptied. The room pulled in around the steady flame of the candles. Julien swirled his glass, watched the legs run, then glanced toward the kitchen to make sure the air belonged only to him. Il parle lentement. Il m'endort. He speaks slowly. He puts me to sleep. I felt my jaw ease rather than tighten. I raised my eyes to his and met them straight on. No smile, no frown. The kind of look a father uses when a room needs a new center. The space between us rearranged itself the way a picture frame finds level after a careful push. The clock on the mantel ticked as if it had always planned to be heard at this exact moment. Julien held my gaze for a beat, then another. Something in his expression shuddered and reopened a reflex he did not control. Emily called from the kitchen that the extra forks were coming and that the coffee was almost ready. He lifted the glass and took a small drink he did not want. Sarah always said respect is not given, it is revealed. The sentence moved through me and set the table straight. I did not need to answer the insult. I only needed to let him see what he had done. Emily came back, offered the forks with an apology for making us wait, and set a fresh napkin by each plate because she is the kind of woman who makes small things easier for other people. I asked for another sliver of pie, and Emily obliged, pleased that the crust still held. I told her again how proud her grandmother would be of that crust, and she laughed and told me to stop being sweet because she would cry and ruin her eyeliner. Julien cut a narrow wedge for himself, and then placed the knife carefully in the center of the plate, as if posing it for a photograph. He said the spice balance was unexpected, and that perhaps Portland had taught us something about restraint. It was meant as a compliment, but somehow he managed to make the room feel like a provincial cousin praised for being presentable. I let it glide past. He waited for it to hit and register. When it did not, he changed lanes. He asked Emily if she had thought about winter trips, maybe a long weekend in San Francisco, while he handled meetings. Emily said she would love to see the tide pools at Half Moon Bay again, and asked if the schedule had room for that. I nodded neither agreement nor disagreement and took a slow sip of coffee. I set the cup down and told a story. Nothing grand. A short memory from Paris. The winter of '95, when snow came late, and a bookseller on the left bank dragged a kerosene heater to the threshold and invited strangers to warm their hands while choosing a paperback. He charged less if you stayed to talk. He said conversation was a bigger investment than cash. Julien smiled and said the city has always been theatrical, then asked whether I had noticed that nostalgia sells better than accuracy. I kept my eyes on Emily because she is the reason for any table I sit at. I asked her about an upcoming design project she had mentioned last week. She said a small boutique hotel in the Pearl District had asked for a rebrand and that she was excited and terrified in equal measure. I told her those are the right two emotions to take to work you care about. Julien said she should tie her portfolio to accounts with more scale. He used words like alignment and synergy, and told her leverage is a friend when you are not afraid to ask it for help. Julien finished his wedge of pie and reached for the bottle again. He poured with the concentration of a sommelier, but the pour stopped short. He said this vintage, while pleasant, was not considered remarkable by some collectors. He said that made nights like this the perfect place for it, because the pressure to worship would ruin the taste. The conversation thinned and thickened like winter light behind thin clouds. Emily gathered plates slowly, a habit she picked up from her mother, to keep a table together between courses. She stacked them neatly and said she would rinse before the caramel hardened. She touched Julien's shoulder and said, "Be right back." He nodded without looking and set his phone face down on the linen runner, a staged act of attention. When she disappeared into the kitchen again, he did not reach for the phone. He looked at me instead. There was calculation in the look, but also a new element, the wary distance a swimmer keeps from a dark patch of water he cannot see through. I let the silence stay. Not an empty silence. A silence with edges. He said, "Mr. Walker, the world moves faster than it used to, and I hope you know I only push because I want the best for Emily." I said I believe the best for Emily includes letting her set her own pace. He nodded, as if we had agreed, and then let his eyes drift to the mantel. I could feel him searching for ground that would hold. The clock marked the seconds like a polite metronome. The tree lights blinked, paused, blinked again. The house settled deeper into the night. I held his gaze with the same care I once held a classroom that needed order without threat. I think he felt it. A faint crease appeared between his eyebrows and vanished. He picked up his glass and then set it down without drinking. Emily returned with the forks she had promised earlier and laughed at herself for forgetting them on the counter. Julien said that sounded lovely. He glanced at me and for the first time did not try to sell anything with his eyes. I gathered the plates nearest me and stood to follow Emily to the sink. The pause felt earned. Behind me, the clock kept time. In front of me, the kitchen light made a small island in the dark. Somewhere inside the moment, a border had been crossed, and even he knew it. For once, he said nothing. I set the plates in the sink and ran a little water so the caramel would not turn to stone. Emily thanked me without looking up the way people thank the person they trust most when their hands are busy. I dried mine on a towel and went back down the short hall. The dining room waited. Julien stood where I had left him, one hand on the back of his chair, as if he had been holding the room upright. He lifted his glass and let the smile return smooth and complete. I reached for my own glass, felt the stem under my fingers, then set it back on the table without drinking. This was one. I let my voice find the calm register I used with students when a lesson needed to land. I spoke in French, each syllable measured as if I were placing china on a narrow shelf. Il est impoli de se moquer d'un homme dans une langue qu'on croit qu'il ne comprend pas, surtout quand cet homme est le père de la femme qu'on prétend aimer. Julien froze with the glass halfway up. His eyes went first to my mouth, and then to my eyes, and then to the door of the kitchen. He set the glass down without finishing the motion, and it made a small sound against the wood, not a clink and not a thud, just the sound of certainty catching itself too late. Vous parlez français? Better than you, I suppose. He swallowed, and the muscles in his jaw tried to arrange a smile that would mean this was nothing more than a cultural game between friends. It did not arrive. His shoulders lowered. His chin came back half an inch. Emily turned the corner with a dish towel in one hand and stopped with both feet just over the threshold. She read the silence first and then the arrangement of the two of us in it. "Is everything all right?" she asked, the way a daughter asks when she knows the question may break something. "Everything is fine," I said, and it was. Not pleasant, not soft, but fine in the old sense of the word, meaning exact. Julien said yes, of course, that we were just sharing a small exchange about language. He said the idea of language is a funny thing, that sometimes meanings get lost in the warmth of hospitality. He reached for his glass and then changed his mind. I stood slowly, and the chair legs made no sound against the rug. I smiled at Emily and asked if she wanted help finishing the dishes. She nodded too quickly and then nodded again in a steadier way and thanked me. I stepped past Julien without looking down and gathered 2 plates from the sideboard. In the kitchen, the water ran warm and steamed gently against the cool air. I rinsed the plates and set them in the rack the way Sarah used to, angled to dry without spots. Emily stood beside me, her shoulder close to mine, and she said quietly that the pie had come out after all. I told her it had the right balance of sweet and heat, that her grandmother would have approved the crust. From the dining room came the faint shuffle of a man rearranging his small kingdom. A chair moved a few inches. A phone was lifted and set down again. No words. Only the sound of someone trying to coax a mask back onto a face that had just remembered it was not skin. I told her I had. I said it was honest. She looked at the sink, then at the doorway, and drew a breath that seemed to change the shape of her ribs. I told her that was a wise way to live and dried my hands. When we returned with cups and saucers, Julien had recovered part of what he had lost. He stood with his weight balanced, the glass refilled, and his expression set to a neutral charm. He told Emily that everything was excellent, that her father had shared a phrase he might steal for a toast someday. I smiled as if I had not heard the request that lived under the sentence and moved to the head of the table to place the cups. The candle nearest me had burned down to a low pool. The wick stood like a black reed in shallow water. I pinched it out, and a thread of smoke rose and turned silver in the tree lights. Emily set down a small plate of chocolates. She asked Julien if he wanted one. He said later, "Thank you." He tried the smile again. It held for 2 seconds and then faltered. He cleared his throat and mentioned a vineyard in the Willamette Valley he thought we should all visit in the spring. He said he had contacts who could arrange a private tasting and a walk through the barrels. He said the owner had a daughter about Emily's age and that the two of them would get along. I thanked him for the idea and said the valley is beautiful in April, when the fields are still wet and the first heat has not chased the green away. Emily said she had always wanted to learn more about the growers rather than just the labels. He told her there are stories and that we would learn together. I gathered 2 empty plates. He reached to take one, and for a second our fingers came near. He pulled his hand back as if something on the porcelain might stain him. It was quick and almost nothing. The body betrays what the mouth keeps dressed. I carried the plates to the kitchen again and let the water run. The sound covered the small tremor I felt in my chest and then steadied it. I told her no disaster has ever come from sweetening a room too much. She touched my arm, and for a moment we stood without words. That was the only prayer the night needed. When I stepped back into the dining room, Julien had moved to the window. He watched the snow fall the way a traveler watches a map, interested only in routes. He turned when he heard me and tried once more to pull the evening into his orbit. He thanked me for the wine, for the stories, for the welcome. All of it marked with careful emphasis, as if he believed he could overwrite one language with another. I let the quiet answer him. Then I walked to the table and lifted the tray Emily had set with coffee and chocolates and carried it to the living room so we could sit where the tree smelled strongest. I said that the couch would be kinder to our backs than dining chairs, and Emily laughed and agreed, grateful for something simple to say yes to. Julien followed with the bottle, attentive, now precise in his gestures, every move selected to signal peace. We sat. The couch settled under our weight. The radiator clicked into a new cycle. I placed a cup in Emily's hands and watched the steam rise against her face. I handed the second to Julien. He accepted it with a thank you that found the right pitch and then faded too quickly. I took mine last and leaned back 2 inches, just enough to let the tree fill the edge of my vision. The night did not need more words. It needed completion. I smiled at my daughter, and she smiled back, and for a moment the room belonged to us again. No one spoke. The clock ticked. Snow lifted and fell in the cone of the streetlight. The border we had crossed held firm and quiet, and the house at last felt honest. We carried our cups to the living room and let the couch take our weight. We pretended to watch the lights across the street, then pretended to finish our coffee. I stood and thanked them both for the meal. Emily rose, fast relief and worry mixed in the set of her shoulders. She said she would walk me to the door. He said it had been a wonderful evening. He said we should do it again soon. I put on my coat, took Emily's hands for a second, and told her the house looked beautiful. She rested her forehead against my shoulder, the way she did when she was small, and I stood still so she could borrow a piece of steadiness. At the door, she asked if I needed anything for the road. I told her I had everything I needed. The porch air was sharp and cold. I said I always did. Emily asked if I would call when I got home. I said I would. The drive back felt longer. I told myself the house would help me sort what mattered and what could be put aside. Inside, I set the bottle on the counter and turned on the small lamp by the fireplace. I told her I had kept my promise. I had not used anger as a weapon. I had not ruined our daughter's Christmas. I had told the truth, and then I had stopped. I called Emily as I said I would, and told her I was home. She said she was glad and that she loved me. I said I loved her too, and to sleep if sleep would come. I washed the few dishes I had used that morning, dried them, and put them in their places. Helen knocked on my door with a container of soup and a smile that knows how to read the weather in a man's face. She asked if I had told Emily anything. I said I had not. I said time would teach better than I could. I went for walks by the river when the snow thinned to slush and the sky hung low like a lid. I thought of Sarah's hands in flour. I thought of the bookseller who charged less for people who stayed to talk. I thought of Emily at 6, at 12, at 20, of her spine straight as a rule when she believed in something, of that same spine bending when she loved. Emily called, but less often and for less time. She was busy. Deadlines. A client who could not choose a direction for a website and might never choose one. I asked nothing that would box her in. I told her I was here and that I always would be. She said she knew. I believed her. I texted Mark Bennett to wish him a new year that would be kinder than the last. He is a lawyer who understands property and people in equal measure, which means he is tired most days. A few nights later, while I was reading a page I had read before for the comfort of already knowing how the paragraph would end, my phone lit with his name. He did not call. He sent a short message. He wrote that a wine importer called Maison du Vin Imports had landed on a list at the State Revenue Office. He wrote that the inquiry looked like taxes and maybe more. He added that Lamarck might be tied by proximity because of shared accounts, and that this town is smaller than it thinks. He said not to repeat any of it unless Emily needed solid ground under a fast conversation. He ended with a shrug in words. Could be smoke. Could be fire. I put the phone face down and listened to the house hear the news with me. I went to the window and watched the street where nothing moved. I spoke out loud in the empty room because sometimes a sentence needs ears, even if they are only your own. I did not call Emily that night. The next morning I taught. My students wanted stories about Paris in winter, and I gave them small ones I could share without opening the places I was not ready to open. We practiced difficult verbs and the music of a sentence when it needs to be precise and kind at the same time. After class, I looked at the phone and waited for it to tell me what to do. It refused, so I went for a walk instead. Days slid by. Emily stopped by on a Sunday with a bag of groceries she pretended she had bought by mistake. She made omelets and told me she had been tired, and that work had been complicated in that way, where nothing seems to land where it should. She did not say Julienne. I did not say Julienne. Emily laughed and then stared at the window for a longer beat than a joke requires. When she left, she hugged me a fraction tighter. I stood in the doorway long enough to watch her car turn at the end of the block. That evening, I read the news on my phone without looking for anything. Still, the eyes find what they are trained to find. A short piece in the business section mentioned an unnamed importer under review. The wording was dry, careful. I washed the plates and checked the lock and sat with the lamp on low and watched the shadows form and unform on the wall. It is a kind of work to let a lesson arrive without pulling it through the door by force. It asks you to trust that the right hour knows your address. In the second week of January, Mark sent another message. It was shorter than the first. He wrote that the state had moved from interest to intent. He wrote that things were likely to tip. No drama, no flourish. Just that. I thanked him and put the phone away and did not pace. I breathed, walked to the mantel, and rested my fingers against the wood that had warmed 1,000 small nights. After dinner, I called Emily to ask about her day. She talked about a client meeting and a layout that finally signaled yes. She sounded tired and strong. She told me she would be out late the next evening and not to worry if she did not pick up. I said I never worry, and we both knew that was a lie used kindly. Snow returned that night in a fine dust that turned the pavement into paper. In the quiet it made, I sat and let the word investigation repeat itself in my head until it lost meaning and became only sound. The house listened. The tree, now stripped of ornaments and willing to be only a tree again, stood outside in the yard and took the weather. Karma does not knock. It arrives on its own timetable, wearing a plain coat, carrying nothing but the habit of consequence. The space between Emily and me carried a new weight. We spoke often enough, but the pauses lengthened, and even her laughter had seams. I kept my questions gentle and brief. She kept her answers tidy. One Sunday she came by without calling first. Her eyes were rimmed in the tired gray that comes from sleep that will not hold. Julienne says work is pressure right now, she said. And then she stopped, as if the words had walked to a cliff and would not jump. I do not think I believe him anymore. I asked if omelets would help. She nodded a small nod for the sake of ceremony, and I set the pan on the stove and found the bowl where she likes to crack the eggs. We worked in silence that was not empty. I slid butter across the hot pan until it shone. He is gone more nights than he is home, she said finally. The stories do not line up. There is always a new dinner, a new tasting, a new shipment that cannot wait. I ask for a plan. He says the plan is to win. I told her she was not small and never could be. I said that pressure is a word people use when they want permission to forget who they are. The kettle clicked off, and I poured tea for both of us. Her phone chimed. She glanced down, frowned, then turned the screen toward me as if she could share the weight of what it held. It was a message from Lisa. It read, "Manager of Maison du Vin under federal investigation for fraud." Emily did not speak. She did not need to. The lines of her face told the story a headline cannot. I could not. I poured more tea even though neither of us needed it. "You are seeing more clearly now," I said. She tapped the link and read, her eyes moving fast, then slower, then stopping on a paragraph halfway down. She put the phone on the counter and pressed her palms against the wood until her knuckles whitened. The room swayed for a second and then steadied. The article was thin on detail and heavy on process. It mentioned filings and a review that had become an investigation. It named no individual at first. Then it named a title and a set of dates that belonged to a man whose responsibilities matched the shape of the shadow that had been moving slowly across my daughter's life. It did not say his name. It did not have to. I read what she had read. The company had adjusted records. The state had questions. Federal counsel had joined. Emily asked how long I had known something was wrong. I told her I had not known. I had suspected. I had waited because sometimes suspicion is an unripe fruit, and forcing it does not make it sweet. She nodded without looking at me. I said it does, and that rushing hurts too. Her phone chimed again. Lisa had written that she was sorry to be the messenger, but she could not watch her friend walk blind. She had attached a second link, a small local business column. Fewer facts, more hints. Emily read, and then closed the screen with the flat of her palm. Enough, she said softly, and the word did not sound angry. It sounded clean. We moved to the living room because sitting in the kitchen made the moment feel like a test, and we had both passed and failed enough tests for one day. She took the right corner of the couch that used to be Sarah's. She folded her legs under and tucked the blanket around her ankles the way she always does when she needs to feel anchored. The window showed only the slow drift of low clouds. He told me last night that if I loved him, I would trust the process, she said. He said that fear is a poor counselor. He said we were building something and that building requires mess. I heard all of that, and something in me went quiet. Not broken. Quiet. She asked if I thought she should confront him right away. I told her she did not have to decide anything today. She could sleep and see what tomorrow made of the world. She could speak one sentence at a time and see which one he answered and which one he stepped around. She could do none of that and wait to see if the truth would volunteer. There are many ways to be brave. I realized then that the tiredness in her face was mourning for a version of a future that had already begun to die. She asked if I was disappointed in her. I told her there was nothing in her that could disappoint me. I said love is not a grade. She smiled, and the smile stayed. I told her that whisper had just become a bell, and that bells are useful because they carry. We made more tea and drank it this time. The warmth did what warmth can. It did not fix anything. It loosened the cold's grip on the edges. She asked if she could stay for a while. I told her she could stay forever, and then revised it to say until she wanted to go home because she likes exits that feel like choices. She laughed and said she would stay through dinner if I would make pasta the way I make it, when nothing else will do. I said that could be arranged. She did not text Julienne. She looked at the phone twice and set it face down. After dinner, she washed the bowls and I dried, and we did not talk about the future. She stood by Sarah's photo and traced the frame with one fingertip. She said Mom would have liked the pie. I said she would have criticized the lattice and then stolen a second slice. Emily laughed and leaned her head against my shoulder. When she was ready to go, she put on her coat and paused with her hand on the knob. She said she felt less alone than she had in weeks. I told her I would be here. She stepped into the hallway, looked back once with that half smile that breaks me every time, and left. After the door closed, the house listened to itself. I took the 2 mugs to the sink, rinsed them, and set them in the rack. I stood with my hands on the counter and let the quiet move through me like a tide that had finally chosen a direction. The headlines would be what they would be. The people would say what they would say. I woke before the sun and sat at the kitchen table with a mug I did not drink. Mid-morning, Emily texted that she was going to see him. No questions. No requests. Only a simple sentence written by someone who has decided what the day must do. I told her to call if she wanted a voice in the room. She told me later how the Pearl District looked washed and colorless, how the streetcar bell sounded too loud for a weekday that tried to pretend it was ordinary. She pressed the buzzer and waited. He let her in without asking who it was. The elevator ride felt long. At his door, she raised her fist to knock, and he opened it before her knuckles landed. She stepped inside and looked around the room with new eyes. She asked if they could sit. She asked about the article. He said it was all politics. He said they were jealous. He said the word they 3 times without naming them. She asked why he had told her the night before that he was in Lake Oswego when his receipt showed a dinner in the Pearl. He said business required discretion. He said some clients asked for privacy. She looked at him until he felt the look. She said, if you can lie about them, you can lie to me. He stepped back and smiled a smile that had been useful in many rooms and found none of its old use here. He said she was being dramatic. He said she had always been too sensitive. He said this was what building a life looked like. He said faith first, questions later. The sky kept its counsel. She stood. She took off her glove and slid the ring free. She set it gently on the table where he could not miss it, in a small square of light that fell between two coasters. She told him that love without honesty is an alibi, not a future. She told him that if he wanted to keep the ring for inventory, he was welcome to it. He asked if she was really doing this now, with everything else that was happening with the firm trying to keep its head above water. She said yes. She said, a drowning man is dangerous to anyone who reaches for him. He moved toward her and then stopped, a strange stutter in a confident body. She said, then outlast this without me. She stepped into the hall and the door clicked shut, and the sound was smaller than either of them expected. I did not know any of this yet. At dusk, I stood by my own window and watched the streetlight push a circle onto the snow that remained. The phone stayed still on the table. The house made the small sounds it makes when it is waiting. I told Sarah that the world was doing what it always does. It gives lessons in its own time and often all at once. The call came late. Emily said Dad and then stopped as if the rest of the sentence had forgotten how to become words. I told her I was here. She breathed like a runner. I told her no one is wrong for loving. I told her you are only wrong when you forget to respect yourself. The line stayed quiet, then I heard her cry. Her tears sounded like Sarah's that night long ago when we were young and foolish, and had to learn the hard way that love without respect is only heat. Life has a way of circling back. I asked if she was safe. She said yes. I told her I was proud of her, and she said the word proud always makes me cry more. She laughed and cried at the same time, and I stood still in my kitchen and let the sound wash the room clean. She asked if I would stay on the line until she reached home. I told her I would count every light with her. She pulled away from the curb and narrated the small things you say when you need to keep your brain busy. I told her the 2 seconds were a gift. She told me not to get poetic while she was trying not to run a red light. We both laughed and the city looked softer for a moment. He said their future needed faith while the investigation played out. She said they could be stronger on the other side. She said she felt smaller being with him than she felt being alone. She said that was the answer she had been chasing without language. I told her she had found the language and it fit. She turned onto her street and the phone slipped while she used both hands to park. I waited. She said she was home. I told her to lock the door and then put the kettle on and then leave it and sit with the tea without drinking if that was better. I told her I was only organizing the air so she could walk through it. She asked if she had disappointed me. I told her there was nothing she could do that would separate her from what I feel. She said, "Will it hurt less tomorrow?" I said yes. Then I corrected myself and said it will hurt differently and then more cleanly, and then it will be something you remember rather than something you wear. She said goodnight in the voice she had at 10 and at 19 and at 30 all at once. The line went quiet. I stood with the phone in my palm for a long minute and then set it face down on the table. I turned off the kitchen light and left the small lamp by the mantel. I looked at Sarah's photo and said she did it, and I felt something in the room let go of a breath none of us knew we had been holding. The house found its night sounds. A pipe ticked once. The heater hummed. Snow began again in a powder fine as flour. I sat at the table with my hands flat and steady and listened to the quiet grow honest around me. Spring found Portland in a softer light, and the city let go of winter like a hand unclenching after a long ache. I had settled into a routine that asked little of me beyond presence. Teach in the mornings, walk the river when the rain allowed, read in the afternoons, and meet Helen once a week at the small coffee shop on the corner, where the staff knew our orders before we reached the register. The banner ran red across the bottom of the screen, and a voice announced breaking news that named a man we knew. The anchor said Julien Moreau, former marketing director of Maison du Vin Imports, had been charged with tax evasion and fraud. A photo of him from a trade event filled the frame, the same smile I had watched organize rooms into rows. The report moved through dates and filings, mentioned falsified invoices and misreported duties, then cut to a courthouse door where a cluster of cameras waited for a statement that would not come. Helen looked from the screen to me and back again. She set her cup down carefully and let out a breath she had been holding since December. She said karma had come faster than either of us expected. I said justice does not need noise, only time. We sat with that sentence between us like a third person who had finally arrived. Charged, not convicted. Alleged, not proven. The law keeps its grammar straight even when the crowd does not. I did not realize until then that my hand had closed tight enough to blanch the skin. She asked if Emily knew. I told her I had not called yet. Emily was on a site visit with a client in the Pearl, and I would not put a wrecking ball through the day she had built. Helen nodded. She said good, and then she said that even right things land hard, and we both went quiet again because there was nothing better to add. I did not try to protect a world that did not ask for my defense. I watched the screen once more and noted the courthouse steps, the gray of the sky, the quick choreography of journalists who can smell a story and a headline at the same time. We walked back in the direction of our street, not fast, not slow. Helen carried the silence well, the way a nurse carries a tray through a crowded room without spilling anything. She said Emily is brave and that bravery does not erase pain, but it makes room for it to pass. I said thank you and watched her go inside. At home, I left my coat on the hook and stood for a moment with my palms against the hallway table. The news had brought no surprise, only a kind of completion. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled down the small wooden box I had not opened in months. Inside were a few photographs, a ribbon from the first gift Emily ever wrapped for us without help, and a stack of letters bound with twine that had faded to the color of tea. I untied the twine and found the one I wanted by the way the paper had worn at the fold. Sarah had written it the winter Emily left for college. I read the first lines even though I knew them by heart, then let my eyes find the sentence that always waits for me in the middle. It said that sometimes silence teaches louder than words. I stood with the letter in my hands and let the past and the present shake hands without ceremony. She was right, as always. The house felt full, but not crowded. I thought of the night at Emily's table, the candle that held a steady flame through a draft, the sentence that had waited decades for its hour. I thought of my daughter standing in a lobby that smells like eucalyptus and money, and finding the language her heart needed to walk out the door. My phone buzzed on the mantel, and I picked it up. Emily had sent a message that held no punctuation, only a string of words that said she had seen the news and that she was home and safe. I answered that I was here. She sent a single word back. Good. We did not need more than that. The world had spoken plenty for one afternoon. I made a sandwich I did not taste and took it to the sink half-eaten, then laughed at myself for forgetting how hunger works when a final shoe drops. I poured tea and carried the mug to the armchair near the window. The television stayed off. I did not need to feel the story repeat itself on my walls. I let the room explain itself with the few sounds it owns. A branch touched the side of the house and slid away. Near dusk, Helen texted 2 words and a heart drawn with characters. "We are." It was enough. I sent back a thank you and added that soup would be a wise idea if she had any left. I set the phone down and returned to the letter and read it again, not because I had missed anything, but because I needed to be reminded that the advice I had used for months belonged to someone who loved me long before I knew how to deserve it. The news would go on making new segments out of the same few facts. Tomorrow there would be a photo of a courthouse door from a different angle. There would be opinion dressed as analysis, and analysis dressed as compassion. People would confuse noise for movement. That was no longer my work. My work had been to hold still until the truth finished its slow walk across the room. It had arrived, taken off its coat, and found its seat. I returned Sarah's letter to the box and wound the twine around it twice, then once more, because hands like rituals when the mind has had a long day. I slid the box onto the shelf and pressed it back until the front edge lined up with the books. In the kitchen, I washed the cup and set it upside down to dry. Then I looked out the window above the sink. The yard was dark enough now that the reflection of the room overlaid the glass me inside superimposed on the small world outside. I watched myself for a moment and thought of the man I had been in Paris, and the man I had been when Emily was small, and the man I had been when Sarah was sick, and the man I was now. The differences mattered and did not. The thread was the same. I sat again and let the house fall into night. I imagined Emily across town in her own living room, the good lamp on a blanket over her legs, her phone face down and quiet. I did not try to fill in the rest. It is a kindness to leave room around someone when the story has ended a chapter on its own terms. By the time the last of the light gave up, I felt the day finish in me. The old box sat back on its shelf, the letter inside the sentence safe and useful for whatever might come next. The world outside kept doing what it does. The world inside the house matched it, finally steady and clear. Snow came back to Portland, like a gentle rehearsal, softer than the year before, and the city wore it without complaint. I set the wrapped tin of cookies on the passenger seat, checked the little plant I had picked for a house gift, and drove toward the east side where Emily had found a new place that suited her life. Her building stood on a quiet street lined with bare maples and a string of porch lights that glowed like low stars. I buzzed at the door and listened to the faint crackle of her voice through the speaker. I reached the second floor and her door opened before I could knock. She stood there with a wreath ribbon in one hand and a smile that made the hallway brighter. Inside the apartment felt like a cup held in both hands. Charlotte arrived from the bedroom in a rush of socks and laughter, a blur of 8-year-old purpose, and ran a loop around the tree, then another, as if she could keep the orbit going by force of joy. She announced that the train was hers for the night, and that no one was allowed to derail it. I told her I had no plans to derail anything, and she approved my answer with a solemn nod and fled back into the room she was using as a fort. Emily took my coat and hung it on a peg near the heater. She told me work had settled into a rhythm that fit. The boutique hotel in the Pearl had signed the final deliverables. She had learned to say no to clients who asked for brilliance on a budget of air. I told her I was proud, and she smiled in that way that stays in a father's chest a long time. Dinner was simple and good. Roast chicken potatoes brushed with rosemary, a salad that tasted like spring had sent a postcard. Charlotte narrated the fate of the train and the rise and fall of the passengers who were imaginary, but had excellent manners. After the plates were rinsed and stacked, we sat on the couch with the small quilt Sarah had sewn long ago. Emily tucked her legs under and leaned her shoulder against mine. She said she had thought about last Christmas more than she expected. She said a year ago the apartment had been a different apartment. Her name had been written next to someone else's in a calendar, and a ring had lived in a dish by the sink. It felt like a lesson that had decided to arrive right on schedule. Charlotte returned with a paper crown she had fashioned from leftover wrapping and placed it on my head without asking if I would allow it. I said kings have limited powers in democracies and that cookies would need a council vote. Emily shook her head and brought out the tin I had carried in, and we pretended to be shocked by the quality of store-bought sugar. Later, Helen stopped by with a pie and a towel and a kiss on my cheek and sat for a minute before heading to her sister's. She told Emily she had found a new bakery that actually understands crust. We drank a little coffee and shared the corners of the pie and let the room fill with ordinary talk. When Helen left, she touched my shoulder in that quiet way that says we did it. Mark called to say he had dropped a card in the mail, and then he forgot to hang up, and we listened to his dog bark at nothing in particular while he apologized to the universe. We said good night, and thank you, and see you soon. Words that carry more freight than they look like they can hold. Outside, the snow decided to make a proper night of it. When Charlotte had finally surrendered to sleep, Emily turned off the train and sat back on the rug and watched the lights try on the ornaments one by one. She said there had been a day in March when she realized she had not thought of him for a whole hour, and that hour had felt like a hallway she could walk down. Then there had been a morning in May when she woke and did not check her phone for a name, and that had felt like a door she could close. She said the world makes room when you decide to take your share of it. She asked if I ever missed Paris. I said I missed it the way you miss a season, not a person. I missed the kind of light that finds old stone and brings out the stories without telling them. She said someday sounded perfect. We made no more plans than that because Christmas is a place where calendars do not get to be loud. The apartment held us like a small boat in a calm harbor. She said she had written a note to herself last winter. It said that strength is not loud. It is the habit of choosing yourself. It was late enough to call it night. I stood and took my coat, and Emily walked me to the door as if I lived far away and time might change its mind if we lingered. She said that she understood now why her mother always trusted my silence. I told her I was only following instructions I had been given by a better teacher. Snow waited on the steps outside like a new sheet of paper. I stepped into it and turned to see her framed by the doorlight. I said I would call in the morning. She said she would beat me to it. The door closed and the window kept our reflections for a moment before the night took them. Driving home felt like breathing in a room that had just been opened. The streets were mostly empty. I parked, carried the empty tin inside, and set it on the counter. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window. Christmas taught me patience. Silence is not weakness, it is preparation. And when truth finally speaks, it needs no translation. If this story felt true, help it travel. Like, subscribe, and share it forward. Then drop your take below. When love and respect collide at dinner, what's your playbook, quiet resolve or clear confrontation?